Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today in this exclusive Senha Segura webinar. We're very excited to have you here, and this will be an excellent opportunity to better understand cybersecurity risks and to learn from all of that. For those who don't know me, my name is David Muniz, and I work at the marketing team here at Senha Segura. I'll be your host for today's session. Before we start, let me give you some housekeeping instructions. The first one is that this session is being recorded and you receive a copy after this session. Everyone is on mute mode and you can feel free to make questions that we will answer after this session. Well, now let's take a moment to introduce our guest speakers. The first guest that I would like to introduce is Morgan Rees. Morgan is the principal security consultant at JWR Identity. With more than 20 years of identity security experience, Morgan has led teams in a myriad of organizations in the design, implementation, operation, and governance of identity security. Our second guest today is Philip Lieberman. Philip is the CEO of Analog Informatics Corporation. Philip is also a software developer, business person, and philanthropist. He holds a bachelor associate degree from San Francisco State in physics with minors in business and computer science. Philip is having an issue with his camera, but hopefully that will not affect our experience during this webinar today. And last but not least is Philip Wiley. Yes, we have two Philips during our session today. So I will call him Phil. Phil is a passionate offensive security professional with over 25 years of information technology and cybersecurity experience. His specialties include penetration testing, security vulnerability assessments, application security, threat, and vulnerability management. Well, I would like to thank our speakers for taking the time to share their knowledge during our session today. So, without further ado, let's start our session. Well, I'll introduce saying that October is the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And here at Senha Segura, we are currently running a campaign to increase the level of awareness of our audience. And as part of this initiative, the topic of today's webinar is surviving through a cyber attack. We're really excited to share what we know with you guys. And during this session, we cover the aspects involved on cyber attacks, like attack vectors, and how to fight against those threats. We will also take questions throughout the webinar, so please feel free to type them into the chat box. Well, I'll start with interesting data. Well, I believe that everyone has noticed the increase of cyber attacks in the last years. And that's not just an impression. Despite another record year of breaches, including SolarWind and Colonial Pipeline, many organizations still have not put a cybersecurity risk plan in place. And according to the report, Cybersecurity Solutions for the Riskier World, in 2021, the average number of cyber attacks and data breaches increased by 15.1% from the previous year. And the question is not if, but when an organization will be a victim of a cyber attacks. So this will go first for you, Morgan. What should CISOs prioritize in their incident response plan to mitigate the effects of eventually a cyber attack?
So, in the mitigation aspect of response to a cyber attack, limiting the impact really is getting to the point of isolation, making sure that you can one identify what's going on, but then once you have identified it, collect all that information and gathering information as much about what's going on. It's then to that point of isolation and getting possibly quarantining and being able to do that evaluation of what has gone on, what what type of attack it is. Is it ongoing? Is something trying to reach out to the internet, to a maybe command and control, something like? But it really is to get to that point of understanding, and then to that point of isolation.
Excellent. Would you like to add anything here, Philip?
Sure. Morgan, one of the funniest things and the hardest things to do is to know you've been breached.
Exactly.
Because they can be in there for weeks, months, even years. And, there's a lot of tools to try to find people who've entered and are using your environment. Any thoughts about that, about detecting them?
Right. I mean, what is it? The average kind of recon period for attackers is somewhere around 200 days, somewhere in there. Spending 9 months of recon, identifying what's going on in your environment and collecting as much information to initiate that attack. So, I mean, you mentioned a number of tools, like talk about threat hunt, kind of internal threat hunts, of going through that process of looking at anomalies going on in the environment, maybe not impactful, but just kind of gathering information on things that are not normal activities within the environment.
Well, what's funny to me is that, besides having my degree, I did start a company called Lieberman Software in the past. So some passing familiarity with privileged identity. I mean, one of the funny things is that we finally came to the conclusion that you have to assume breach.
Yep.
And that operate your organization assuming breach, which means reorganizing the architecture so that whatever damage can be done can be minimized by architecture or by other continuous mitigation and or other controls, which is one of the reasons I was so happy to be on this broadcast with David and the rest of you, is that, PIM and PAM are really great ways of living in a world of being breached, yet still limiting the damage.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't you agree, Maureen, that that's the case?
Absolutely. I was actually looking at CISA's annual assessment report for 2021. And I was looking at, they kind of put these across the MITRE attack framework, and looking at different areas that the agencies, they do it across agencies, federal agencies, local governments, state governments, and everything. They do assessments, and they had about 112 assessments done in 2012 or 2022.
Excellent.
Sorry. And what we noticed was that in the top level of a lot of these attack vectors is compromised accounts. They're using valid accounts to gain access and as a attack vector. And as you said, Philip, I guess Philip. There we go. That the protection of privilege, especially, is critical, and that in kind of limiting and controlling that the attack.
Any thoughts here, Phil? What do you think?
Yes, just kind of mentioning, I kind of heard someone mention about the architecture. I think, making sure that you've got proper network segmentation in that can kind of stop some of these attacks. Most networks are flat. So if an attacker gets a foothold in, that they've got access to anywhere in the environment and can be in there for months or years without being detected. And whenever you do suspect an incident, don't waste your time. Make sure you quickly get your IR team on it, or bring in a third party to investigate, try to find any kind of incidents of compromise to make sure you can stop that as soon as possible.
Well, Philip and Morgan mentioned something really important about privileged credentials, but also Morgan also mentioned about, we'll talk about more privileged credentials later on in this webinar, but I'd like to stick on the connected to the internet, as we have more connected devices that are connected to the internet. And well, there's a study from Cisco that says that there will be 29 billion connected devices in 2023, up from 18 billion in 2018. And many of those devices are legacy, and that increases considerably the attack surface. And the proper protection of those legacy devices and application is still a challenge for cybersecurity leaders, as they were designed not considering the risks associated with internet exposure, for example. Those risks can include, for example, outdated software and the lack of security features to ensure their protection. And I'll bring up to you, Philip. How do you think that CISOs can ensure the properly protection of those devices?
Sure. Well, the classic case was Home Depot a few years ago, where they put their HVAC systems on the same network as their IT systems, which led to compromise. The other issue is, even if we're not talking about home devices, within an organization, you have vendors that need to get into certain parts of the network from time to time in order to do work. And they may, in fact, even have persistent credentials. And so really what Phil was talking about was the idea of re-architecting your networks. And then the typical way of doing it is to provide VPNs and also to provide PAM solutions that provide jump servers that get you into those specific areas on a time-limited basis. The big issue with IoT itself is that when you buy the device, there's no guarantee of it being maintained for security. And the people who are using these devices don't really have much awareness of the risk that they're taking with their devices. And so not only are the devices compromised and the networks really phished for information, but they're also used as outbound attackers. So these devices, cameras and other devices, can be flipped around, software changed, and then these become botnets. And this has been a real serious problem. In fact, one of the things that, Morgan and Phil and I have always seen is that the way you detect the intruders is not by what they're stealing, but by the fact that they're using up all your bandwidth, using up all of your CPU. And you're realizing performance is very poor. And the reason for the performance is because somebody else has taken over your network. So in my view, the IoT problem is pretty intractable in the home world. You can set up separate networks and try to control it. But in the corporate world, it really requires looking in the heart. IT has to literally scan their network constantly to see what's been added to their network. And I think one of the challenges today, and this goes back 10, 20 years, is because a lot of organizations are outsourced. They don't have the expertise to do those scans. They don't have the resources to do their scans. And so to use an expression that's been overused, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how many times your organization is going to be taken over. And so I think, every good CISO, for resiliency and reliability and the ability to recover, has to assume that really bad things are going to happen. And rather than lose their job as CISO when the breach happens, they really have to have a really good plan to deal with this. So I would say that they need to scan their network, they need to reorganize their network, and they need to have different ways of ingress and egress in order to control this. And again, that's where PAM comes in, is that that represents, you basically put hard walls up around everything. And in fact, we've worked with environments that were Windows 95 and XP. There was nothing modern in them. And the way they solved the problem was they basically isolated the network away from the internet, didn't allow internet access. And they basically just segmented it off to just run whatever their applications were. And that's one way of solving the problem, is just pure disconnection or pure air gapping. But I'm sure the other members of this discussion have other ideas too about how to solve this.
Excellent. Any thoughts here, Phil?
Yes, I think some good opportunities too is accessing these applications through VPNs. using products like Citrix and set up, run published apps with the environment so that way you can connect to those externally without the risks of being connected to the internet. Because, one of the big risks we see out there is the type of protocols and services that we're exposing to the internet. Something like RDP is not a good idea because, threat actors are constantly monitoring our threat surface. They're looking our attack surface. They're constantly scanning. The latest vulnerability comes out. They're using tools like Shodan to try to detect those vulnerabilities so they can hack in. They're not always looking for the most difficult thing to hack. They're taking that mindset of working smarter, not harder. So they're trying to find easy ways in. So I think one of the best ways we can do that is just minimize our threat attack surface and make sure we're monitoring what's being exposed to the internet. Because there's a lot of things that don't need to be exposed. For the company I work for, we have a platform that takes care of this. And one of the things we've seen is PLCs and ICS environments expose the internet. So anyone could, if they could find that web page, they could go in, shut down equipment, start or stop. And this could be like a water treatment facility or manufacturing, which is very risky to expose to the internet. And even things like if they have to be exposed, then maybe limit what IP addresses have access to those systems to try to cut down on who has access to it.
Malicious attackers will also always find a way to catch up with the security team. That's something true.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to add anything here, Morgan?
No, I think there's a large aspect of was covered on the external kind of internet connected devices. Internally, I think it was mentioned about segmentation and even getting to the point of microsegmentation. What I've seen in my career, I worked in a number of hospitals systems, and with that, with what they were deploying, the IoT devices, you get devices, and as they were saying, I think Phil was saying that they don't really do a great job of maintaining the, you might say, the patch level of their software running on the IoT device. They don't add a lot of security levels, and so segmentation on the internal networks for those IoT devices really is beneficial. Another thing that I'm seeing in the market is some tools that will layer in MFA in front of these legacy applications and systems that may not have the ability to utilize like MFA natively, but you can have tools in front of it to put that MFA layer there.
Well, I think I give my opinion on this. Cybersecurity vendors, they have a hard time to, especially considering that OT devices and IoT, they're not designed for the exposure to the internet. So many of those devices even don't have any access control to their interface. And I want to stick on with something that Philip said about visibility. And it's very interesting because lots of reports that we see, they mention about visibility and discovery and understand what is your environment. And there's a saying that it is impossible to protect what is not managed, and it's possible to manage what is not known. So I believe visibility is really important in this case. And for machine identity, since we're talking about, let's now take a look at privileged credentials. And privileged credentials, at least for IoT and DevOps and all of those machine identities, they are quite harder to protect because, they're not associated to human, and they are usually not monitored. So usually malicious attackers, they use those unprotected, unmanaged machine identities to perform their activities. And still talking about privileged credentials and identity, this is a common attack vector that is used by malicious attackers to perform their attack. I have a data here from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report that 40% of data breaches occurred through the use of stolen credentials. Now, I'd like to understand from you guys, why are privileged credentials are so explored, and why so many solutions fail to protect those privileged credentials. And I'll start with you, Phil. What do you think on this?
Yeah, that's a very, very popular area, because working as a pen tester and knowing that we use the same type of techniques threat actors do, is leverage these credential dumps. And a good example for people to protect themselves is the website Have I Been Pwned, to see if your credentials have been pwned. There's actually some products out there that are like password firewalls that will check for any passwords when you go to change your passwords, if you're using a password that's come from a breach. So it's a very popular vector, and it's just a lot quicker for attackers to get in with known credentials, opposed to trying to go through and crack password hashes.
Go ahead, Philip. You're saying.
What's really funny is in our scanner that we built, we preloaded all of the known passwords, the most popular one being blank, and just scan a network, using the open ports. And it's remarkable how many systems. In one case I was thinking about, it was actually a medical facility where there were X-ray machines and scanners, CAT scans, that were running Windows and had a blank password, because the operator hadn't considered the fact that those systems were visible. And so, writing using Nmap or using a scanner is really pretty easy to do. And if you have infiltration at one point, doing footprinting is the next step, is to see what you've got on the network. And then after that is to try all of the standard credentials. I mean, there are also websites, not just the dark web, but there are websites of known administrative accounts for different devices. And devices, when you ping them or you connect to their ports, will tell you what they are. So it's not particularly difficult to work your way through the environment to see what you've got and see what your scenario is. I mean, that's the advantage of tools. And one of the things that we recommend to clients is they do red blue team at least once a year, but some do it quarterly, where one team tries to break in and the other one tries to defend. And that seems to work well, but it's expensive and it's also disruptive to the organization. So it really comes down to the prioritization of security and resiliency and recoverability for the organization as to how important that is.
Excellent. You, Morgan?
Yeah, the interesting question I think that's posed in this area is, why aren't people doing what they can to protect their privileged accounts? And I think it comes to a couple things. One is lack of visibility. I think been mentioned. It's like it's just not seen. It's not seen as a priority. And the other is that it hasn't been prioritized enough, knowing that getting a privileged account on certain systems, basically keys to the kingdom, you can kind of take over the whole environment. So I think there's a fear of complexity along with it as well. It's like, okay, how do I do this? I know that there are a number of tools out there that will go and scan and collect credentials and everything that enable you and kind of help in that. But I think there's just there's a little bit of distraction, prioritization that just isn't there in some cases. And that the current environment, they're doing good enough. What they have in hand and their process that they are doing is good enough to satisfy the need for whatever kind of compliance or regulatory kind of oversight that's being done, the environment, industry they're in, that the protections of their accounts satisfies that need, but not really providing security. As we know, is like compliance, meaning being compliant doesn't mean you're secure.
I mean, it's
Being
funny,
compliant
Morgan.
doesn't mean that you're secure. That's a good saying. Go ahead,
I
Philip.
mean, people want aspirins, not vitamins. And so, I mean, we've all seen this where there's no money for cybersecurity till there's a breach. Then the wallet comes open to buy something, even if it's not going to be implemented. And then the half-life of 3-6 months, as people forget about it, the wallet closes again. So it's very strange. There are very few organizations that are proactive in security. There are some that are excellent at it, but most are really event-based. They respond to the event, start a project. But one of the issues is that finding people with the expertise who know how to do this is very rare. So a lot of times they buy products and don't implement them, or they don't use them correctly. So I'd say the gap is a money gap. It's a focus gap. It's also the expertise gap. That is, identity management and network segmentation is a unique set of skills that very, very few companies have. Even in large companies, that's a rare skill to have. And there are few people who have the authority to say, today the network is going to change. There's going to be interruption. There's going to be inconvenience because we need to survive this breach. So you need a lot of power to do that. And it's hard to get that for most CISOs.
And what are the other, we've talked about PAM and we talk about identity protection. And what are the areas of investments do you think CISOs must prioritize for the upcoming year, for 2023, Philip? I'll start with you on that.
I think, my philosophy has always been assume breach, assume the worst case scenario, actually calculate the dollar consequence as it's happening today, and make decisions to force all business units to conform with a strategy that will actually survive the breach. So effectively, the issue is that you have to put the dollar number down, or whatever your currency is. You have to accept it's going to occur. And just pushing it off or putting it into insurance isn't going to resolve the problem. I mean, this is another issue. Insurance companies are not paying out anymore if you don't have a robust security program. So I think it's really an issue that you really do have to take it seriously. And as a CISO, I know how difficult that is, because you may not have the authority to deal with it. I would say if you don't have the money, your best use of money is to have a third party scan your network, show you what's wrong, and then present it to the board and let them deal with it, and give them mitigation strategies that will actually help solve the problem. I mean, you have to be proactive in this. So I would say, engage a third party. If you don't have the resources, do a scan, do a red team scan, and see what it really looks like, and go from there, because then you're dealing from facts and reality.
Okay, Morgan?
Great points by Philip on this one. I definitely agree. I'll add on a little bit to that assessment aspect of kind of identifying and knowing what you have in front of you and what challenges. So doing a proper risk assessment will help you prioritize your financial investment, where the most effective money can be spent. But in general, if you want like specifics right now, I mean, in general, I think there's a huge work from home. I mean, with the pandemic, a lot of work from home, remote workers, a lot of investment, a lot of kind of focus has been on the remote worker. And I think there still is a lot of organizations that have done a fair job of securing the endpoints and the users. There was the idea that the perimeter is now the identity. Identity is now the new perimeter, right? So with that, securing the identity and the endpoint device, those are critical when it comes to the remote worker and basically the new, you might say, I hate to say the new normal, but that's kind of where we live right now.
Excellent. Any thoughts here, Phil?
Yeah, some really good points, and I like the idea of the scanning and stuff. So one of the areas, we've mentioned on here that some network segmentation is a very not well understood area, and so is offensive security. It's one of the most misunderstood areas because I've worked in companies that people didn't know the difference between a vulnerability scan and a penetration test. So you want to make sure you're leveraging those different types of things. You're running your pen test, but you need some kind of recurring vulnerability scans, monitoring your threat vectors, your external attack surface. Make sure that you've got something that's constantly monitoring changes in your environment, so you're testing, because if you don't know about something, you can't test it or protect it. So make sure that you're monitoring those things. And I do like the point that Philip brought up about, if you don't understand it, bring in someone that does. And the thing about consultants is you can bring in a consulting company to help you guide you on not only doing a pen test, but how to improve your program. Get some advice from them on how to, because they're dealing with different companies all the time, give you advice on how to set up some things in your environment so you're not always dependent on the third party. But I do agree that that's a great idea of using third parties.
Well, Philip brought something really interesting here about the risk assessment and also the insurance companies. Now, we've been hearing a lot about insurance companies that are providing this kind of products for companies. However, I agree that those insurance also require the companies to do regularly risk assessments to check that the company is properly investing in cybersecurity and properly addressing those risks. However, the CISO has to convince the board to invest in cybersecurity. Do you guys think that it's enough to have just a recommendation for the insurance company? How do you as CISOs can convince the board to properly invest in cybersecurity in a company? I'll start with you, Morgan.
So one of the things, I would say a board is very short-sighted if they aren't already have cybersecurity in place. The problem is you might say, okay, what is the appropriate level? And as Philip alluded to, it's like, okay, without proper security program in place, what is the payout going to be by the insurance company? So the challenge really is identifying what your exposure, what your financial exposure is to an attack, and getting the proper coverage for your insurance. So it really does come down to that assessment. It comes down to, I believe, a business impact analysis that needs to be done across the whole organization to make sure that your mitigations are in place. You're doing the best you can internally from a technical standpoint of putting in place protections, but then also, as was mentioned, it's not if, but when there'll be an attack, and probably a high likelihood of a breach. So having insurance, I think the convincing is that insurance is needed is not going to be difficult. It's going to be what's the proper level, and identifying what the proper level of insurance and coverage.
Any thoughts here, Philip?
Yeah, what's funny is in my new startup, since we're dealing with medical health data, the insurance company now scans our network, and they require us to do an attestation of all areas of security, including privileged accounts. And the nature of this creates a contract now where I've made representations as to how I'm backing up my data, how I'm controlling my identities, whether I'm using MFA. And so now the insurance companies have changed their strategy, which is they're doing external scans themselves, preparing a report, and then saying this has to be fixed, or your insurance is canceled. And the internal attestations is a real key issue, which is if you said you scanned it and you followed these best practices and you didn't, and you have a breach and they come in and audit it, you don't really have any insurance. You're really going naked as far as they're concerned, and they won't pay out. So the insurance companies have become much more aggressive in verifying and forcing attestation. They're not really accepting a third-party auditor who makes happy talk. They're actually now looking at specifics that they want before they'll insure you. So the world has changed quite a bit because the insurance companies are tired of paying out. The scam is the corporation will say, we can cut down our cybersecurity, we can cut down our IT department because we have insurance. And if something goes wrong, we'll just cover things by insurance. So the insurance companies have now taken massive losses and they're going, no, I don't think so. Now we're putting it on you. It's now you have to be secure, and we're going to check it because they're just tired of litigating. And the fact is that the organizations who did not have the proper security lost. The insurance companies did not pay out, and the courts held for the insurance company. So we have a new paradigm today.
Okay, Phil?
Yeah, I think those are some great points about bringing up the insurance. And, one of the things we need to do in organizations is make sure we're secure and not use insurance as a crutch. If we're PCI or whatever compliant, that doesn't make us secure, and not lean on things like risk acceptance. I've worked in organizations where, either didn't have the budget or people just didn't want to mess with remediation, and they would just file risk acceptance. Back in my consulting days, I performed a pen test where I got command line access through a SQL injection vulnerability from the internet. And the company filed an internal risk acceptance because it was a development server. I still got to it from the internet, and it was out of scope to go past that server, but could have possibly pivoted into other areas of the network and gain access. So we have to learn that those are kind of things to give you time to remediate, but not use it as a crutch or way to avoid remediation.
Excellent. An excellent point from the three of you. And I'll stick with the insurance part. Well, basically, insurance is, a transfer risk. The company is transferring the risk to a third party. And I'd like to bring the news about the Uber CISO that was under justice. And I want to talk about accountability in this aspect, because we've seen before, like in the Enron and all of these accounting scandal, do you see that we might start seeing CISOs going to jail and being convicted of crime, of data breaches? How do you guys see that? I'll start with you, Phil.
Yeah, hopefully that's not the case, but it seems like it could be a trend. I mean, that you see a lot of cases in the past that CISOs just got fired for breaches, but really hard to predict that. So hopefully kind of not, I wouldn't really like to see that, but just hopefully it's just motivation for, people to do all the right things to try to prevent being breached. But it wouldn't surprise me to see that, a lot of people are looking for their scapegoats, and, sometimes the CISO is that.
Scapegoat, that's a good word. Would you like to add something here, Philip? Sorry.
I've seen CISOs who discovered things on their network, brought it up to the board that were in some cases even criminal, and decided to leave. Others will stay because they have kids in school and they need to put braces on them, and they just figure they're going to get fired. The CISOs are well aware of what's going on. And you bring up a good point as to what's their personal liability. I think it's very difficult because, corporations are not human beings, and there's certainly a lot of people involved. So it's very hard to put the finger on the person who caused the problem, especially if it's a board. If they vote as a group not to implement suggested remediations, then you can't put the whole board in jail for, here's the thing, if incompetence was a crime, there'd be a lot of people in jail.
Excellent point, Philip. Would you like to add something here, Morgan?
Yeah. My only thought is when you talk about a CISO, it depends on that, say, the corporate structure. So if that CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, is actually an executive of the organization, then what is their financial responsibility? Do they have you might say responsibility for definitely reporting to the board? Do they report internally to the COO or the CIO, or do they report to the board? Can they be held liable for malfeasance with regard to proper expenditure and findings within the a security kind of program of making sure that their expenditure and the program is executed properly? Not sure. I agree with Phil on this. I'm not looking forward to the day when that might happen. I don't see it being something would be common, but it's one of those kind of risks you take as a CISO to say, "Hey, I'm going to be leading the security program of this and take responsibility." So, it's a difficult situation to be in. I know.
I think it'll happen about the same time that lawyers are held accountable and thrown in jail for incompetence.
Yeah, lawyers throwing lawyers in jail. I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Well, many of those attacks happen through ransomware, and and it's also, of course, there's also something that we discussed during our preparing for this presentation is about paying or not, or the ransomware, the ransom. And ransomware is a common attack vector that is used by malicious attackers to perform their activities, and we've seen a huge amount of malware and ransomware variety, including ransomware as a service, which I think gives the power to lots of incompetent people to spread out malware and other malicious software. We also have malicious code on the emails, links, websites, untrusted DLLs. So this makes it difficult for cybersecurity solutions to protect the infrastructure against all of those threats. So considering ransomware and all of these threats that we've spoken now, what organizations can do to reduce the risk of being victim of this kind of malicious software? And I think it's part of every CISO's nightmare, being attacked by ransomware. And I start with you, Phil.
Yeah, I think you just have to make sure to take an approach of addressing all the ways it can be delivered. So making sure you're going beyond the security awareness training, that's important, but also do some phishing campaigns where you're actually got something besides the pre-canned phishing attacks that go out and people see that. What ends up happening too is more of your tech savvy people will know the domain names they come from and just send that to the trash and not even mess with it. And they're not paying attention. So periodically bringing in a company or your internal pen test team to perform phishing campaigns is a good thing. Something else you want to do is use something, and like some of the tools like Proofpoint. If you click on it, it prevents you from executing malicious codes and stuff. So that type of thing. We really want to get past not having to depend on the end user not to click on things, and then also remediating findings from our vulnerability scans and pen tests, because a lot of these ransomwares are leveraging vulnerabilities to actually work. WannaCry is one example of it. So making sure that you're addressing it through the overall program remediation, as well as different products that prevent people from clicking on items and kind of preventing those actions from being executed.
Excellent. Philip, your opinion on this?
That was really great, Phil, because you're right. They are going to click. They are going to be to deal with it, and this also brings up bring your own device versus company issued devices, and the idea of sharing these devices is really the road to hell is paved with good intentions of allowing these kind of mixed uses, which the thing that I've seen effectively that helps us is people are working from home and they're in the corporate network. How far they can span in the corporate network is highly limited when they're outside the organization, and more controlled inside, or more liberal inside when they're using a machine that's been issued by the organization that has whitelists and controls. So I think that it's really a good idea to consider that if you are running remotely, that your scope of access, both in the network and as well as identities, really has to be constrained pretty severely. The other thing we've seen is even with whitelist, we've seen problems with whitelist solutions, that it's a lot of work to maintain a whitelist solution, especially with patches coming in every day. And you end up with interruption. And so you end up loosening the whitelist until finally you just give up. So there's a cost to stopping this. There are platforms, by the way, that are less susceptible to this. But I mean, there is the issue of how far you can get out of the browser in terms of it being a sandbox, if that's what you're looking at. So I'd say, again, this is a patch issue. You're right, Proofpoint is great. I use Proofpoint too. But Proofpoint has its own issues, driving you crazy with links that it generates. So it's difficult. It's a really tough problem to solve. And the other question, David, is do you pay the ransom? And you get your availability and get your data back? It's a really tough question that involves legality, but also practicality. And it's surprising who pays and why they pay. I mean, you have to be practical at some point rather than, it's hard to be pure as the driven snow when all of your systems are down.
Yeah, I think especially when you don't have a backup at place. I mean, if your backup is affected, I think it can be tricky to pay or not the ransom. But fortunately, we expect the CISOs to at least take care of the backups in order to recover the environment. Your points on this, Morgan. Answering the first question that we had.
Sure. So from a ransomware perspective, I would say some of the things mentioned. One thing we did at a prior company, ran a program, Cybersecurity Month, right? Training and making it an effort. And the phrase we used was to all the employees was, "You are the human firewall." Had that on there, made a little marquee for their monitors that they could see that all the time, knowing that there is a chance that they are going to be constantly under attack. So that mindset of kind of making that a part of the company culture to advance the idea of security, that they're not just the consumers of it, but they are the ones helping to implement security within the organization. The other is there are some key things about ransomware, and part of it is a lot of them will reach out to a internet site to grab keys for encryption and all. So one thing that we did that was helpful, not absolute, but very helpful, was having a DNS that was reputation based, limited DNS searches and things from reputational, so that if it was a new site or wasn't like within the last 24, 48 hours or a week, I forget exactly what the limit was. But then also if it was a known malicious site, that reputational information helped prevent those callbacks to the central server.
Yeah, you guys mentioned something really important here about clicking on an awareness, and especially now that we're in the Cyber Awareness Month, I like to say that it's useless to invest in the state of the art of cybersecurity solutions without addressing the people aspect. So what is the purpose of investing in those solutions? Of course, and trusting, put the burden of those solutions if your user clicks on a malicious link. And the point here is that CISOs should and must invest in the cyber awareness of their employees and third parties. And we've talked about ransomware and how those kind of software can explore zero-day vulnerabilities. And since the organization might not be ready to address those, well, but they are not ready at all to address those vulnerabilities, it increases the chance that malicious attackers explore them to perform a cyber attacks. And we need to take into account that it might take some time for vendors to properly release an update to patch the device or application. So taking that into account, what advice do you give to CISOs in this case when they are affected by the zero-day vulnerability to proper protect their infrastructure and to avoid a data breach? And I'll start with you, Morgan.
Sure. So from a zero-day perspective, I mean, it's really, really difficult. Identification, we talked about being able to identify attackers within the infrastructure and in your network, doing threat hunt and everything. On this, it's more of identifying from a 0 day, say like malware being deployed, identifying the activity that looks malicious. Identify if it, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's usually a duck. So with that, having those behavioral analytics running on the different endpoints on your networks, having that is a great way to at least identify and kind of have that early warning as to kind of activities, malicious activities going on, or possible malicious activities. It's not always, but it's a safeguard that is definitely beneficial and will help identifying that 0 day. The other thing is that I think is usually not done very well, and that's the local privilege account protection. There are a lot of people, and there's an idea that users need to have that a local admin, their account needs to be local admin or access to a local admin so that they can manage their system themselves. While that helps in the ease of the administration of applications, installations, doing different things, it definitely opens up a security hole and allows for accounts to have privilege elevation on the system.
Phil, your turn.
Yeah, some really good points Morgan made there. And even aside from just the accounts that users are using are your service accounts. Because like on various pen tests I've done in the past, I was able to exploit a web-based vulnerability or even like a Java server vulnerability. And when I got access, a lot of cases they were root if it was on a Linux or a Unix system or NT System Authority on Linux system on Windows systems. One of the things that's happened in the past is for people to get things to work securely, they just take the easy way out and give as much privilege as possible. But if an attacker is able to exploit like a web-based vulnerability, it could be in any kind of service. And if they're able to access that service account, then they're running as that service. So that's some really good points that he brought there. And then as far as like 0 days, it's hard to protect against those. So you have to make sure you're doing all the things right, have your security hygiene in place, that you're monitoring your attack surface. Some cases, the people you have perform your pen test. I've known some pen testers for some consulting companies that are actually finding O days on the pen test they're performing. So the level of people that you're using to perform your pen test can help mitigate against that. But just basically overall, making sure your security hygiene is good, you're covering all the bases. So that way, if something happens, then it's not able to go further. And just as Morgan mentioned, like the privileged account access. So that way, if someone is able to elevate privileges, so you want to make sure that you're kind of mitigating all those areas and make sure you got your security hygiene up to par.
You know, one of the things I would say is that as an application designer that's building secure apps, we have to start at a different place and time. And we have to ask ourselves the question at every level and every component, what are we going to do if we've done everything correctly, but they still get through because of a 0-day? And that's a really big issue. And it requires not only designing software a certain way and patching it a certain way, but you need to have a way of restoring service of a system that's been compromised by a 0-day. And you may go offline, you may change your firewall rules. You really are in a really bad place. The only thing that will save you is good backups, a lot of coffee, and some hard decisions as to what you're going to do to go forward. With regard to lateral motion or lateral movement within the network, you should always assume that. You should always assume that the 0-day or whatever the vulnerability is going to allow lateral motion, either by credentials that will give you access or by the network. So what's funny is that we're now, our new company is all in the cloud. And what's interesting about the cloud is that the cloud with containers and Lambdas have network turned off by default, identity turned off by default. Everything is turned off by default. Every network is segmented from every other network. And it's really hard to punch through and to provide access between different areas, even in things like Kubernetes. Ingress and egress are very complicated to do. And even with all of that, you still can get it wrong and really horrible things can happen. So there are third-party scanners that we use for the cloud to try to pen test what we have. But you have to, again, it goes back to the same thing. Assume breach. Assume the worst is going to happen. Look at your architecture and say, what happens if we lose this? How far can they go? Suppose we lose this, how far can they go? And how long is it going to take for us to bring this back online? So, having multiple data centers, having good backups. The other issue is you may change how you're hosting your solution. You may find that running it in a Lambda is not working. Now you have to put it in a standalone EC2 instance and put firewalls around it in order to get it to work. I mean, you just have to assume you need really smart people or really good consultants to help you to deal with it. It's just really hard.
Excellent insight, guys. We still have time for one last question, and I will stick with the cloud aspect that you've mentioned, Philip. And we know that in the last few years, we've been seeing an increased adoption of cloud environments, and many organizations are moving a company's digital assets, services, databases, IT resources, and applications, either partially or wholly, into the cloud. And there's an interesting data from the 2021 Cloud Adoption Survey from O'Reilly that 90% of respondents stated that their organization used cloud computing compared to 88% in 2020. And still, according to the same study, almost half said that they plan to migrate 50% or more of their applications to the cloud in 2022. However, it's a mistake believing that cybersecurity in cloud environments is only on the shoulders of CSPs. According to Gartner, through 2025, 99% of cloud security failures will be the customer's fault, not the CSPs. So taking all of this into account, what aspects should information security leaders, CISOs, to properly protect, what they should consider to properly protect those cloud environments? And I'll start with you, Philip.
The issue is if it's a lift and shift, I mean, you took something that's running in your data center that's within your four walls, you wanted to save money, so you lift it up and you put it in the cloud, thinking they were going to provide you with better security. You're dreaming. You will get potentially lower cost, maybe, but your problem's just got a lot worse. If, on the other hand, you say the move to the cloud is a chance to re-architect, to rebuild, and to take an insecure solution running in our four walls and build it as a secure solution that is cloud first, that's a wonderful thing. That may actually improve things and improve your business. So I think it's very dangerous to lift and shift. There are environments, for example, Microsoft has a secure environment for the federal government. There are other private clouds, and there are also colos that will just basically run your hardware in a cheaper place and VPN into your environment. So I think it's a question of architecture that you choose. And again, I would caution people who are lifting and shifting their workload to the cloud that if they think they're getting a benefit, they're getting better benefits in CapEx because they don't have to buy new hardware. They're getting potentially easier backups, maybe, but it's not a simple answer. It's the cloud is not the answer. It's just another modality of hosting with all new architectures that are worth looking at. But your old stuff working in the cloud doesn't make it fresh, shiny, and new and better.
The cloud is not a target; is a mean. I like that. I like that saying. Phil.
Yeah, some very good points by Philip there, and you hear some of the misconceptions that people think if you move to the cloud that it's more secure, but you can misconfigure things there. But one of the things I think companies really need to look at is make sure they got the talent that is experienced in cloud, and to educate their existing employees if they're going to be managing these cloud assets and infrastructure. So make sure they're properly trained, as well as not only how to use the technology, but on the security side of things. And then make sure that you're having pen tests performed against your environments. Some people think cloud platforms won't let you test, but they will let you test. But so make sure you're doing those type of items. And one of the things too is I know like Microsoft Azure offers some other tools, which is too bad they don't include it for free. Some other security tools that are extra cost. I would spend the extra cost to make sure that I'm secure, opposed to just trying to save the money and not get those added security features.
Excellent. Any thoughts here, Morgan?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's been said is right on. I think along with that is understanding and the things have been mentioned before about understanding what your exposure is, what is your attack surface for your cloud environment. And are you protecting that well? There's also the fact of consistent and well understood configurations. And I think Phil mentions like having the right people to understand exactly how to properly configure and secure your cloud infrastructure is imperative. You just have to, if not, you are setting yourself up for a breach and for exposure. And I mean, there's definitely a lot of liability there.
Well, the funny thing is people who put their code, once they go to the cloud, they put it in GitHub and they leave it open publicly with all of their keys. I mean, there's just really horrible things. Everybody thinks the cloud is secure, but there's just been so many breaches by so many stupid things that you need a different team for the cloud. The cloud is not like on-prem. The cloud and your developers working in the cloud and developing their applications and doing, your ICID, doing, the updates. You have different cadences, different ways of updating. It is so easy to make a mistake and to leave something in your environment file that shouldn't be there, that is now on GitHub, or somebody can just read the environment file from a breach. And so your four walls were good. They were better in some ways, but that's not the future. So fun and games with a cloud. It's better, but there's a big asterisk that new threats, new scenarios that you have to deal with. And it is retraining and it's harder. I would warn you, the cloud is a lot harder to secure and a lot harder to manage. Maybe I'm just dumb, but it was easier in four walls than it was in the cloud. And the other thing is, I recommend getting support from your cloud provider, buying paid support from your cloud provider. The cloud is highly changeable. A lot of times the documentation that is online is wrong, and that you'll have problems. You have to sometimes go back to the cloud vendor and ask them to explain how it is today, not how it was documented a month ago. They are notorious for changing things and deprecating things. So if you're trying to maintain a secure environment and availability, you do need their support. You can't be on your own anymore.
Excellent points. Well, guys, we're running out of time. That's a very interesting discussion. I'd just like to open for your final words right now so we can wrap up and finish the webinar. So I'll start with you, Phil. Just final thoughts about everything that we've talked so far.
Yeah, I think it's a really good discussion. And one of the main things I like to emphasize to people and we mentioned earlier is to make sure that you're, trying to be not just trying to be compliant. You're trying to make sure your environment's secure. Don't depend on risk acceptances and insurance to keep you secure. Those are good things to have. Leverage them when they're needed, but make sure that you're making sure your environment's secure. And as Philip had mentioned before, kind of leaning on experts. So if you don't have the expertise in your organization, bring in consultants to help you, achieve your goals. It's not worth cutting corners to put yourself at risk.
Excellent. Morgan, your final words?
Sure. I alluded to this earlier about changing the culture of your organization to where there's a emphasis on everybody being a part of the security solution. It is to some extent a top-down perspective that it needs to be driven by a champion within the organization. Hopefully that champion is not just the CISO, but it goes above that to where the CEO and the board are championing these ideas of delivering security within the infrastructure, within your environment, no matter whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. But there is an understanding that doing security well takes everybody being a part. They say it's only as strong as your weakest link. That's really true. And I mean, one minor gap can be devastating.
Excellent. Philip?
There's hardware, there's software, and there's wetware. And wetware is where most of the problems begin. But it's also the place where if you have really smart consultants, really good pen testers, really good architects, and I'm a big believer in automation and technology, overcoming the limitations of wetware. And that the idea is that with the right people at the right time, with the right technology or staying on top of it, you can actually run a secure, highly available environment. But it is a full-time job, and you have to hire really smart people, and you have to use the best technology that's out there. And it takes a lot of work. And so, I know it's unpopular. I would not recommend using Gartner for their decisions as to who has the most checkboxes. I think you need to look at your situation uniquely, evaluate all the vendors and the technologies that are out there, and use what's best for you, and re-examine it every 3 to 6 months as to what is actually working for you and what is reducing risk and giving you the best availability. So it's hard work, but it's worth it because your company can survive through this, but only if you assume breach, you assume that these problems are there. It is easily survivable, but you need really smart people to do it.
Totally agree with you, Philip. And I believe personally that there's not a silver bullet. Cybersecurity is a combination of aspects. It's processes, it's people, it's tools. So I also believe in a combination of those. And PAM is also a part of this. Protecting privileged credentials is part of the cybersecurity strategy. And using a solution like Senha Segura, for example, ensures the proper visibility and protection of your privileged credentials in the environment. Our discovery capabilities have been considered as best in class by Gartner and BioMarket. And we believe that the PAM is part of ensuring the digital sovereignty of people and organizations over their data. So with that, I would like to thank you all for participating in the webinar, the pain list. That was a rich conversation. I'm very happy for that. And we're out of time for questions, but we have noted them and we'll send to the panelists and we'll get back to you guys. So I'd like to thank everybody who attended this webinar, and hopefully that added value to your to all of you. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Morgan. And see you guys, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.